is the court's exhibit number.
Are you talking about the transcript of the 23rd?
Yes, Your Honor.
That's Court Exhibit 6.
Okay. I would like to have the court also have, for record purposes, what that is the original, a transcription service was sent this, and they sent that back, and it was bait stamp pages 5,000. I just had my post-it note here. I'm sorry, 5,455 through 5,557, September 9, 2013. Once it came back, numerous listings and some revisions to it were made, and bait stamp later provided to counsel saying this is the finalized product. The finalized product was bait stamp numbers 7,721 through 7,802 that did not have the last page of some transcriptionist. And then as to those bait stamp pages, there were 2 more pages from that interview sent saying, hey, I think the word glasscock was misspelled twice. But this was and is, for whatever court purposes would be, we're not trying to admit this, but this would be the state's contention of that final. The audio is extremely hard to hear.
All right, let me ask Mr. Arbor, what exhibit, what version have you marked as Defense Exhibit 15?
Right. This witness is with the defense now. He's not with the state. I've shown him a transcription that was provided initially from the state to us. It's on bait stamps, page 54, 55. My questions will extend through 3 interviews done of this witness. If at some point this document that we've marked as Defense Exhibit 15 doesn't refresh his recollection, and he wants to use the other document because it'll refresh his recollection better, I have no objection to using that. So far, he hasn't indicated that this hasn't refreshed his recollection, and he is answering my questions. If at some point we should renew our motion to submit either of these transcripts, and the court should entertain that, then the defense will not object to using the most updated transcript. But for the purpose of refreshing the defendant's recollection, we're fine proceeding with what we have.
I was just trying to let the court have an alternative exhibit for the record purposes and whatever issues that may come up in the future. I'm just letting the court
Unless, of course, the state would like to stipulate and let this document in which case, no objection.
All right. We will, for the purposes of refreshing the witness's recollection, it's if this witness has said what he has in front of him does that, and Mr. Arbor has chosen to use the version that he's provided to do that, then for that purpose, that's fine. Now, if at some later stage, Mr. Fawcett, you wish to tender the final version of this interview for the purposes, either for the court's purposes or record purposes, then we'll talk about receiving that. But we can certainly proceed as Mr. Arbor chooses with an earlier version of this.
Yes, John, I just wanted to make that known. I just kind of figured out that these were earlier versions.
Good.
I just wanted everybody to know.
All right. And I did not address your Rule 403 objection that you also cited in addition to hearsay objection in my prior ruling, but I will note that that is an objection that you're making as well. And if at some later point you wish to be heard at that, then we'll make a ruling on that as well. But I just wanted to let the record reflect that I have considered your Rule 403 objection as well. All right, let's bring jurors in, please. for this witness, sir?
Yes, Your Honor. Detective Morse, on the 22nd of, I'm sorry, the 23rd of April, the day after this happened, you recall asking the defendant if he remembered what happened.
Yes, sir.
You had examined and looked at a number of pieces of evidence that you could locate in the short time that you had in between the time of this event and the time that you're at the hospital at 1:30 on the 23rd. You incorporated some of that information into your questioning of the defendant. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
When you went and did the interview on the 23rd, did you ask him if he had a knife when he went to the house that day?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to your question without providing you the response?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him where he kept the knife?
Yes, sir.
Objections. Move to strike.
Sustained.
Move to strike the answer.
Jurors to disregard.
Detective, had you been at the house, prior at the house, crime scene, prior to going to see Mr. Broyhill at the hospital?
Yes, sir.
Didn't you testify that you'd seen a book bag?
Yes, sir.
Didn't you testify that you had looked at the contents of the book bag?
Yes, sir.
Didn't you testify that you found a knife in the book bag?
Knife packaging in the book bag. Yes, sir.
Did you ask it, which would give suspicion to the fact that there may have been a knife brought to the house? Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
So on the day of the 22nd, did you ask him if he brought a knife to the house?
On the day of the 23rd, yes, sir.
23rd, I'm sorry. Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
You knew that he had been injured prior to going to the interview. You're in the hospital room, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him about his injuries and what happened to him?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
You knew from the statements that you had collected from other people that he had known the Hans prior to the events of the 22nd and prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him about his relationship with the Hans?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
You had learned information that he had been an employee of Mrs. Hahn prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him about that employment situation?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
Asking about someone's employment status is a typical question in an interview, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Did you ask him about his employment status at that time?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
You had learned some information about the fact that these people, by that I mean the two victims, my client, other people, had been out on a beach trip prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask him questions about that?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
Did he ask you about the people that went on that trip?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
When you have an event of this magnitude, a stabbing, which is a violent act, you agree?
Yes.
It is not uncommon to wonder as to the person's state of mind at the time that they committed the act. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Broyhill about his state of mind in that interview?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
In the course of doing an interview, when you have suspicions that the person's state of mind may have been at issue prior to the event, do you often ask whether they have done anything about the issues that they talked to you about in the past to address those issues? For example, if you're doing an interview and someone tells you that they're feeling a certain way or have acted a certain way, that would lead you as a detective to believe that it's the kind of thing they might have gone and sought maybe medical treatment or something of that nature, wouldn't it be typical for you to ask a question about whether the person has sought out that type of treatment?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask such a question at the interview on the 22nd?
Yes, sir.
23rd?
23rd, yes, sir.
Did Mr. Broyhill respond to you?
Yes, sir.
When you're presented with information of that nature, and you've asked somebody information about that, isn't it typical to follow up and try to find out where they might have gotten treatment? That may lead you to look for other information that may help you explain further the events that you're trying to get explained. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask similar follow-up questions in this case?
Yes, sir.
On the 23rd,
Yes.
did Mr. Broyhill respond to you?
Yes.
When you have people that you've asked questions of, and there's an indication that there may be some issues regarding why they acted a certain way and whether or not they've received treatment, it's not uncommon for you to follow up to find out whether or not they were responding to perhaps some medication, correct?
Correct.
People sometimes react when they're on medication, and that can cause them to act out of their normal behavior, right?
Yes.
It's not an extraordinary question for you to ask. In fact, it's a typical question to ask, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask such a question in your of Mr. Broyhill in your interview of him on the 23rd?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
When there is a known or suspected weapon involved in a crime of this nature, prior to conducting an interview, and you had examined the book bag in this case, is it not uncommon for you to try to find out where the weapon came from?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of that nature of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd of April?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, there came a point subsequent to your interview on the 23rd where you were able to go and look at a grocery store called Harris Teeter to track down information that has been entered into evidence in this case regarding the purchase of a weapon, the weapon that was that you now believe was used in this crime. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
That happened after your interview of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
When you have a crime of violence, and this would be termed a crime of violence, correct?
Absolutely.
Particularly one that happens between people who would otherwise typically be seen as characterized as friends or close. It would not be untypical to ask questions of whether or not there were events that caused a strain in the relationship of those people. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of that sort in your interview of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
And just for clarification, at any point, had Mr. Broyhill said he didn't want to talk to you anymore,
No, sir.
you would have stopped.
I would have stopped.
You did not stop on that day, is that correct?
No, sir.
When you ask questions of a person in an interview regarding their mental well-being, particularly when faced with a crime like this, that you've characterized as a crime that does not seem, as you said, didn't seem to have any reason for it when you were first preparing your first reports, and you're trying to ascertain the reason. If you identify an issue, do you ask follow-up questions about how long, if you identify a problem in an interview that you think could be a cause, do you ask follow-up questions of that person about how long the problem may have been an issue for that person? Is that typical?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of this sort in your interview of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd of April?
Objection.
Sustained.
Note my objection. That is the normal course to ask follow-up questions when you are provided information from a person you are interviewing. If it leads you down a certain road and they tell you something, it's not uncommon because this is an interview that's happening on the 23rd, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Because you don't know what's happened. You're trying to figure out what's happened, correct?
Correct.
So if somebody tells you something, you're going to ask follow-up questions typically to see where that leads you, correct?
Absolutely.
Throughout your interview of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd, there were a number of topics that you followed up. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And when you asked follow-up questions to Mr. Broyhill, did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
He responded to you to every question you asked of him on the 23rd. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
You knew that 3 people were injured in this event prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
There had to have been an order in which the injuries were sustained. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
You didn't need a response from the defendant to ask questions about that. That would be a logical question for you to ask in light of the fact that you have 3 injured parties. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
So in a typical interview of that sort, you would ask the question, would it be not untypical of you to ask questions about the order of events of the person you're interviewing? Isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
Did you ask such questions of Mr. Broyhill on April 23rd?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
And similarly, if the answers are not satisfactory when you do an interview, where they don't answer your questions, it's not untypical to ask the follow-up questions I just followed to see if you can get clarification. Would that be fair?
Correct.
Did you do questions of those sort on the 23rd of April with Mr. Broyhill at Wake Med?
Yes, sir.
I asked you earlier whether or not there were certain theories that you were trying to investigate about this crime prior to going to the interview on the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
One of the things might be whether or not there was some kind of love triangle going on, correct?
Yes, sir.
You needed to interview to see if that was an issue. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions about that issue of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd in Wake Med?
I did.
Did he respond to you?
He did.
You knew that this was an employer-employee relationship between Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn prior to going to the hospital room on the 23rd of April, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes a strained employment relationship, like the one we talked about earlier, could be a theory for a crime occurring, correct?
Absolutely.
Requiring investigation, correct?
Yes.
Requiring questions to be asked about that relationship and about whatever strain may exist in that employment relationship, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had received information prior to this that he'd been laid off.
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions about that at the interview of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd of April?
Can you direct me to a page, please? Make sure I get this right.
Sure. $54.91. At the top of the page,
Yes, sir. I have some questions, yes.
did he respond to you?
Yes, sir.
Finding out about the relationship of these people and getting in depth about it and asking follow-up questions about it to try to ascertain what would have caused these events. That's not untypical in an interview of this sort, correct?
Correct.
Did you ask many questions of my client on the 23rd regarding those types of issues?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to all those questions?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes when there's an event of this sort, there are things that happen in the day leading up to that event that can be of value in trying to figure out what happened. Would you agree?
Yes, sir.
So it's not untypical when you do an interview of this sort to ask the person to relay to you their activities for the day leading up to the time of the crime, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's a standard procedure, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of that sort of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you,
Yes, sir.
to all the questions?
Yes, sir.
Received some information through interviews that had been done by other officers of Mr. Hahn, other officers with Mr. Hahn, that on the day of the 22nd of April, Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill were going to meet and talk about some things involving this Brad Miller campaign, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you had been received that information prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
So it would not be untypical to ask questions about what these parties were doing with respect to those duties when you were going to question my client. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you did in fact ask those type of questions, correct?
I did.
And did he respond to you?
Yes, he did.
Similarly, in an area of that nature, when you're asking questions, there's follow-up questions that you'll think of as you're getting responses that cause you to ask more questions about, to get further details, correct?
Absolutely.
Did that happen in this case?
Yes, sir.
And you asked follow-up questions.
I did.
Did he respond to you?
He would, yes.
There had been an issue mentioned earlier that had been addressed to you prior to going to the hospital on the 23rd. You put it in your report, that initial report that we talked about the possible embezzlement of money, correct?
Yes.
Something that you've investigated in the past and have experience in looking into, correct?
Yes.
be very helpful to have that experience when you're going to question him, because you have that familiarity having worked on embezzlement cases in the past, correct?
Certainly.
Oftentimes, there's a lot of similarities in why people embezzle, correct?
Correct.
So you knew that was going to be the issue, one of the issues you were going to talk about, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so was that topic brought up when you went to go do the interview of my client on April 23rd?
Yes, sir.
When you went to go ask him about these matters, you had been advised previous to going into the hospital by other officers and through your own investigation of everything else, of this discrepancy that we've talked about, correct?
Correct.
You've heard this amount of the $900. Mr. Hahn gave a different amount in court, but it's essentially the same, hundreds of dollars, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you asked Mr. Broyhill about that issue because it was something you had been alerted to prior to going to the hospital room, correct?
Yes, sir.
On the 23rd.
Yes, sir.
And you would have been derelict in your duties if you did not bring that up, correct?
Correct.
Because a money issue could be something that might trigger an event of this sort.
Absolutely.
Although typically you wouldn't think something in and I'm just saying all cases, in the hundreds of dollars would trigger something like this, correct?
Fair.
And you asked Mr. Broyhill about whether or not there had been any embezzlement going on. Isn't that true?
I did.
Isn't it true that Mr. Broyhill gave you an amount far in excess of the amount that you had been alerted to prior to going into the hospital room on the 23rd?
Objection.
Sustained.
I'll come back to that. You knew about, asking him questions about the embezzlement issue, were there additional questions asked that you formulated based upon responses that you received from my client with respect to that issue?
Yes, sir.
These were follow-up questions that caused you to seek clarification of the information he was giving you. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that would be typical as well of an interview, correct?
Absolutely.
Particularly if the information you're receiving is not consistent with information that you have previously received prior to going into the hospital room, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you would make note of any information that seemed extraordinary or different from the information that you had received prior to going into the room. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Because it would require further investigation when you're done doing the interview, correct?
Yes, sir.
And on the day of the 23rd, in talking with my client about that issue, you did receive information that caused you to do additional investigation after the interview was over. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Including like Detective Gill's testimony about having to suddenly contact the State Bureau of Identification and the Board of Elections to see whether or not there had been some reported large loss of money from the Brad Miller campaign account. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
And that happened after the interview with my client on April 23rd, 2013 at Wake Med. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
The questions that you asked him about led to information regarding this bank account that we have heard about in the trial, this Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
Yes, sir.
This caused you to ask follow-up questions regarding issues or questions you needed to have answered regarding that account, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you asked a number of follow-up questions of my client regarding your concerns and questions that were popping into your head regarding this Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
I did.
Did he answer all your questions?
Yes, sir.
Done embezzlement investigations before. One of the issues you try to ascertain when you're doing an investigation that suggests there's been an embezzlement is to try to find out why the person would embezzle, correct?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes that's to see if it will lead you to perhaps a source where the person's money might be that has been embezzled from them, correct?
Correct.
Sometimes it's to see if it explains why the person embezzled, correct?
Correct.
In this instance, you asked questions of Mr. Broyhill of a similar nature regarding why embezzlement had occurred and what this money would have been used for. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
All the same questions you would ask as if you were doing an embezzlement investigation, correct?
Exactly.
Did he answer all your questions?
He did.
Embezzlement is a crime that involves two parties, an employer and an employee, correct?
Correct.
It's not untypical when you're asking questions regarding an embezzlement, whether or not the person who's doing the embezzlement was aware or alerted to whether or not the employer had found out about the embezzlement. That might be a cause to investigate to see whether or not that would have been a cause for this crime occurring. In other words, retaliation or revenge for being discovered in this embezzlement. Agreed?
Agreed.
Did you ask questions of that sort of Mr. Broyhill?
Yes, sir.
Did he respond to you?
He did.
On the 23rd of April, you had not developed any independent information as to whether or not the Hans were aware of any embezzlement taking place. Isn't that true?
I had not.
In fact, you did a subsequent interview of Mr. Hans some days later, asking him whether there was any awareness on the part of himself or Ms. Hahn as to whether or not there was any embezzlement going on. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
On the 23rd of April, after your interview, based upon what you knew, there was no indication that you knew of that anybody was aware of any embezzlement going on the 23rd of April. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And with respect to the responses you got regarding the embezzlement, it's not untypical to ask questions of, as I said earlier, what was the money used for? Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you asked all those types of questions, all the ones you could think of, based upon your training, your experience, and your past experience of investigating embezzlement cases. Did you ask questions of that sort in this case
I did.
on the 23rd?
I did.
Did Mr. Broyhill respond to you?
Yes, sir.
I said earlier that when an embezzlement case happens, a person's taking money, they're taking money from an employer, correct?
Yes, sir.
In this particular instance, it wasn't exactly, based upon your investigation, a true embezzlement in the sense that it was a money taken from the employer itself. Is that fair?
Correct.
It was technically money that was being managed in trust by the employer, correct?
Right.
The Brad Miller money was not Ms. Hahn's money, correct?
Correct.
This was Brad Miller's money that got taken.
Exactly.
A former congressman of the United States. You knew that prior to the investigation, correct?
Yes, sir.
So in asking him about embezzlement, it leads you down a series of questions, if not in this case, in all cases, as to where the money went. Because maybe you can retrieve some of it and get it back to the rightful owner, correct?
Yes, sir.
You asked all those questions, correct?
I did.
And Mr. Broyhill responded to you, correct?
He would.
This event happened nearly 2 years ago, correct?
Yes, sir.
You've owned this case for 2 years, correct?
Yes, sir.
In those 2 years that you've owned this case, you were not able to uncover anything other than perhaps the Volvo car that suggested anything of value, any deposited in a bank anywhere, could retrieve this money for Mr. Miller, correct?
Correct.
And the defendant, my client, was not living, based upon your observations as an experienced homicide detective, what could be termed an affluent life. Would that be fair?
That'd be fair.
Also ask not just what they did with the money, but when you're asking someone in an when you know there's possible embezzlement, you ask why they took the money, correct?
Correct.
And you asked questions of that sort on the 23rd of April, didn't you?
I did.
And Mr. Broyhill responded to you, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes when a person doesn't give you the answer you're looking for in the early part of an interview, that doesn't mean that you necessarily then are done with that topic, correct?
Correct.
Sometimes you got to go back and hit it again, right?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes, and in fact, if I, just based upon how this is going, you sort of have a professional demeanor when you go in to do an interview. Would that be fair?
Absolutely.
Your demeanor is almost the same when you do an interrogation, correct?
For me personally, yes.
This, and I'm not saying it to make a joke, this bow tie you're wearing today, okay? You started wearing that when you became a detective, right?
Yes, sir.
And you wear it every day to work. Not that one, but you wear a bow tie to work every day, right?
Yes, sir.
When a person meets you, like Mr. Broyhill did on the 23rd of April, you're going to look somewhat similar in appearances to what you are today. Maybe you don't have your suit coat on, if it's summer or something, but you're going to have a business shirt on, dressed in business attire with the bow tie, correct?
Yes, sir.
When you come back for any subsequent interviews, you're going to be dressed the same way, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
That person's going to think, this guy is a straight shooter. That's a tactic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
To make that person feel like it's okay to talk to this guy. And that's a tactic that they teach, right?
Yes, sir.
You've had time to perfect it, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's why you're a homicide detective, right?
One of the reasons, yes, sir.
You're one of an elite crew.
Yes, sir.
I hope you're going home and telling your wife the answers to these questions. You're investigating a serious crime. You know that Mr. Hahn and Mrs. Hahn had left the house at some point on the day of the 22nd, and you know this prior to going there on the 23rd, correct?
Yes.
So, you also know that Mr. Broyhill had not escaped the house, correct?
Correct.
You knew he'd been in the house when police surrounded the home and took him into custody and found him in the condition that they found him in, correct?
Yes, sir.
It's not uncommon for people who do a serious crime of this nature to try to run away so that they are not caught by the authorities. Isn't that fair?
That'd be fair.
So when a person stays at the crime scene, that is a behavior that would not be typical of, for example, flight. Flight is evidence sometimes of guilt. Would you agree?
Yes.
There was no flight in this case, correct?
No, sir.
which added to the confusion of why did this happen, correct?
Yes, sir.
So it would prompt you to ask questions typically of why a person might not leave, correct?
Yes.
Did you ask a series of questions in this particular case regarding that issue about why Mr. Broyhill didn't leave the house? 5511.
I see that question, yes, but it,
That's a
I don't-
different question. That's
Correct.
That goes back to what he was doing that day.
Right.
That went back to trying to recant for him, not, that's the wrong word. Recover with him things that he might not have told you earlier in the interview, right?
Right.
That's going,
I'm confused about the status of the multiple questions at this point.
I'll rephrase.
Yes, sir, please do.
It's it's protocol. You asked a series of questions earlier regarding a person's activities the day of the event, leading up to the event, correct?
Correct.
If you didn't get all the answers, it's not untypical to go back and ask follow-up questions, even though they didn't give you all the answers that you were looking for earlier, correct?
Right.
They might give them to you later on, correct?
Exactly.
You asked those types of questions in this interview of Mr. Broyhill, isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did he answer your questions?
He would.
When you have a violent crime of this nature, it's not typical for most people to engage in such acts of extreme violence. Would you agree?
I'm sorry, say that again.
It's not typical of the average person to engage in extreme acts of violence. Would you agree?
Agreed.
Sometimes when people are violent, it may be worthwhile to know whether they've had any violent tendencies in the past, correct?
Yes, sir.
A lot of times when you get a case where you have an act of violence before you, prior to interviewing someone, you'll pull their record to see whether or not the individual has ever been arrested before, perhaps for an act of violence, correct?
Correct.
Because that would be an indicator of whether or not they are violent.
Correct.
You saw a whole bunch of arrests, for example, that the person's been arrested for fighting or assault or things of that nature, correct?
Yes.
That would lead you to believe this person's a fighter, correct?
Correct.
And it's typical to have done a search of that nature prior to going to do an interview of an individual, particularly in a homicide case, correct?
Yes, sir.
I don't know if you did, but I would assume, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you ran a search on Mr. Broyhill prior to going there that day.
I did.
You didn't find anything, did you?
No, sir.
Just because you don't find anything doesn't mean necessarily that a person hasn't been violent. Isn't that true?
Correct.
A person can be violent without getting arrested for it, correct?
Correct.
So sometimes it's worthwhile to ask the person if they've ever been engaged in acts of violence. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Because you never know. They might just tell you, correct?
That's right.
Things that you would never have known about unless they told you, correct?
Correct.
Did you ask Mr. Broyhill
I
if
did.
he had any prior acts of violence?
I did.
Did you, were there any responses received that would have been inconsistent with the record search that you had done prior to going to the hospital that day?
Objection.
Sustain.
Were there any, I'm not calling, no. Were there any responses, forget about the responses. You conducted questions regarding Mr. Broyhill's past conduct.
Yes, sir.
Had there been acts of violence that you learned about that typically would have resulted in you doing follow-up interviews with the people that he might have been violent with? Would that be fair?
Yes.
Did you do any such follow-up interviews of anybody?
No, sir.
And again, with respect to these questions, Did he answer all your questions?
He did.
Just like you returned questions about the events of the day, and that's a tactic, right?
Yes.
Make the person at ease. If you haven't gotten satisfactory answers regarding what happened on the day, it's also not untypical to revisit that issue. Is that fair?
Correct.
Did you revisit that issue with Mr. Broyhill that day, the 23rd of April,
Yes.
and ask more questions?
Yes.
Did he respond to you,
He would.
to all your questions?
Yes.
Prior to some of the officers had said that Mr. Hahn had shared with a number of them that he had diagnosed with cancer. Is that correct?
Yes.
We already covered the fact that cancer can be a despondent, correct?
Yes.
An issue you were going to follow up with the 23rd, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions about that?
Yes, sir.
If you had received information at that interview, there was a medical condition, such as something like we've talked about, pancreatic cancer, you would then seek to go verify whether or not that was in fact the case. Wouldn't that be? Seek to reach out to doctors about that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Talking to Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd of April, you did not reach out to any doctors, clinics, medical personnel regarding him having pancreatic cancer, correct?
I did not. No.
To that issue as well, regarding him having the cancer, correct?
There was.
And he for you, didn't he?
Yes, sir.
Provided information prior to going to the interview, because you recall Detective Smith had already met with Mr. Hahn.
Correct.
That was the night before in the triage area. Second, about to a doctor's appointment at Duke. So that was an issue that you need to investigate on the 23rd of April, correct?
Yes.
And did you ask questions of Mr. Broyhill about all of that?
I did.
And did you ask follow-up questions, responses to you?
I did.
And did he answer all of your questions on that day?
He did.
When you do an interview of an individual where you're gathering information, and in the course of doing that interview, it could be attached to the person you are interviewing, correct?
Yes.
And at that point, on the 23rd, you are trying to gather facts to understand this event, correct?
Correct.
So your police training will tell you that if you are learning information in an interview issue in your interviewing, you are going to ask questions about that as well. Wouldn't that be fair?
Yes, sir.
About why there are credibility issues. Wouldn't that be fair?
Yes, sir.
On the 23rd of April, did you ask those types of questions of Mr. Broyhill?
I did.
Did he answer your questions?
He did.
All of them?
Yes, sir.
Somehow prior to going to the interview, perhaps someone in the course of your investigation, you had received some information regarding these donor reports, correct?
Yes.
You had been at the crime scene, correct?
Yes.
You had seen the kitchen table at 1705 Tealwood, correct?
Yes, sir.
By that point, you are there when were you there, by the way, when Stacy Johnson of the CCBI came by and took photographs?
Yes, sir.
You were there when she took the folders that were on the table, the kitchen table, and opened them up and photographed the different things that were in those folders, correct?
Yes, sir.
You saw the things that were in those folders, correct?
I did.
You were able to observe them.
Yes, sir.
So that gave you some information prior to going to the interview to suggest that that might be one of the things they were going to talk about on the day of the 22nd, Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill, based upon all the things you had investigated prior to going there that day. Would that be fair?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of Mr. Broyhill about the donor reports,
I did.
including all the follow-up questions that would come up from the answers he gave?
Yes, sir.
Did he answer those questions?
He did.
All of them?
Yes, sir.
Again, during the limit to how many times you can go to cover something that you don't feel has been fully answered for you, correct?
True.
Including, most importantly, the issue of what happened.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall going back to the topic for a third time when you went to the interview when you heard of April 2013 at Wake Med,
Yes, sir.
and asked a series of questions regarding the event again, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did he answer all your questions?
He did.
Now, at the point that you're doing that, you have some facts available to you from your own investigation, correct?
Correct.
Things, for example, like you knew there was a book bag, right?
Yes.
You knew there were things on the table, correct?
Yes.
Sometimes an item, a location of an item, something in the room can trigger a person's memory as to what they may recall of an event, correct?
Yes, sir.
And sometimes you'll use those items in seeing whether or not it will trigger a recollection from the person you're interviewing, correct?
Correct.
Like the book bag.
Yes.
Do you recall trying to do that with Mr. Broyhill?
Objection.
I
Overruled.
believe the testimony is that the book bag was something he
Overruled.
knew about prior
Mr.
to...
Arbor, overruled.
Thank you.
I asked him about the book bag. Yes, sir.
In an effort to try to jog his memory,
Objection.
doesn't call for any hearsay response. I'm asking him what he's trying to do.
Oh, let me consider the objection.
Overruled.
Sorry, ask the question again.
Were you trying to use items such as the book bag to try to trigger a response from Mr. Broyhill about the events of the day?
Just objection, since this is a new question
Overruled.
Yes.
Which led to a series of other questions, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did Mr. Broyhill respond to all those questions?
He would.
And if he said anything, and this would be typical of any interview, that required clarification, you would ask questions seeking to get clarification. Isn't that correct?
I would.
Did Mr. Broyhill respond to all of those questions?
He did.
You knew that a knife had been used in this attack, correct?
Yes, sir.
So it would be appropriate to ask questions about the knife, correct?
Absolutely.
Not only where it came from, like we talked about earlier, but how it was used, when it was used, how it was retrieved, things of that nature, correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you ask questions of that sort of Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd of April?
I did.
Did he answer all of your questions?
He answered some of my questions. Yes.
Some of the answers didn't provide you with enough information to have an answer. Didn't give you information. Would that be fair?
Objection.
He's doing an investigation, Your Honor. He's got to figure out where to go.
Sustain this to form.
Did all of the answers you received from Mr. Broyhill on the 23rd answer all your questions as to how this occurred?
No, sir.
But he remained cooperative in answering your questions.
Yes, sir.
Including about how this event, correct?
Correct. He continued to answer my question. No, sir.
He did not at some that didn't happen, did it?
No.
He continued to answer all of your questions, because if at some point he had said, I don't want to talk about it, you would have stopped, correct?
Correct.
And you didn't.
Correct.
And just like anything else, if you're asking questions about something and it's not clarifying what you need to have clarified, you're going to ask follow-up questions, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you did in this case, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Broyhill responded to those questions, correct?
He would.
But it didn't answer why it happened. Would that be fair?
Fair.
Sustain.
Note my objection.
The motion to strike is allowed. Juries to disregard the last response.
There came a point where the interview came to a conclusion, correct?
Yes.
Now, at that point, Mr. Broyhill is in a hospital bed. Agreed?
He is.
He's got armed police officers standing outside the room 24/7, but he's not going anywhere. Would that be fair?
Correct.
And he knows, would it be fair to say that he's a suspect in this crime by the time you're leaving the interview on the 23rd of April?
He should. Yes.
Is it typical in your process to give the person you're interviewing a little bit of a rundown of what's going to happen next,
Yes.
including the possibility that you might come back and talk to them,
Yes.
including that when you do, and you may not share with it that time, but if you do, and because this is very serious assault at that point, It's fair to say that you're gonna follow your protocol, and before you start getting into anything of any substance with this gentleman, anytime you talk to him, you're gonna get into the Miranda waivers first. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
Did you recall telling Mr. Broyhill that your plan was to come back and talk with him again?
I did.
You recall telling him that you might come back the next day, which would have been the 24th, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you did not go back on the 24th, correct?
No, I did not.
You might have gone, I don't know, you might have gone to the hospital, but you didn't go talk to Mr. Broyhill on the 24th.
Correct.
In fact, when you're telling him of your likelihood of coming back, the reality is you do go back, but it's on the 25th, correct?
Correct, on the 25th.
And even before you leave the room, you have another detective with you there, correct?
There is Detective Gibney.
And sometimes, in an interview process, when you have two guys like that, sometimes a person will respond to certain individuals' questions, sometimes they don't, right?
True.
Sometimes one detective might be successful in getting information, another one might not be, correct?
True.
And sometimes one of the procedures is that if the first person's not getting responses, the second person might jump in, correct?
Absolutely.
Now, you had gotten a lot of responses that day, would that be fair?
I did.
But it still didn't answer all your questions as to how this happened. This, and I'm talking specifically on the 23rd, correct?
Objection.
Sustained.
On the basis, a request of basis? Not asking for any hearsay. You left the room on the 23rd and you still didn't have all the answers to how this thing had happened. Isn't that fair?
Objection.
Sustained.
On what basis?
Hearsay and Rule 403.
It's not relevant to know why a crime of this nature happened? How is that not relevant?
Ask your next question, sir. It's sustained.
No, my objection.
Yes, sir. Rule 403 does not deal with relevancy.
401 does.
I'm
And you don't
sustaining
get to 403 till 401.
All right, sir. Go ahead with your next question.
Before leaving that day, Detective Gibney asked a few questions before leaving the room. Isn't that correct?
He did.
But they weren't very long, or as detailed as yours were, correct?
They were not.
They were mostly regarding the employment status between Mr. Broyhill and Ms. Hahn, correct?
Correct.
Now, you've heard testimony in this case from Detective Gill when he took the stand, correct?
Yes.
After this interview occurred on the 23rd with my client, Detective Gill is tasked with contacting these agencies about the Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you were familiar with that because you're the lead detective and you were here during his testimony, correct?
Yes, sir.
You knew, even prior to the trial, you've known all the aspects of this case essentially, correct?
Try. Yes, sir.
After this interview, Detective Gill is contacting these agencies to see whether or not there had been any reports made with the SBI or the Board of Elections, correct?
Yes, sir.
He was looking to see whether or not there was $20,000 missing from the Brad Miller campaign account. Isn't that correct?
Objection. Oh, I'll withdraw that.
Go ahead, sir.
He's inquiring into any investigation, embezzlement investigation at that point. I'm not sure if it was a specific dollar amount, but he was seeing if there was an investigation going on.
It'd be fair to say that subsequent to the interview of the 23rd, the information that you had gathered was significantly different from what you had gathered prior to going into the interview on April 23rd.
Yes, sir.
That's as a result of an interview with my client, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
So now you have to go and investigate that, and that's what Detective Gill testified about, correct?
Yes, sir.
Which he did. We won't rehash that. The jury heard that. But then there comes a point on the 25th now where you and Detective Gill then decide to go talk to Mr. Broyhill again, correct?
Yes.
Twenty-fifth of April, so now we're talking Thursday of that week, correct?
Yes, sir.
At about 6 o'clock in the evening, you and Detective Gill went to go meet with Mr. Broyhill, who is still in Wake Med as a patient, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, on that particular day, is similar to the time that you had been there the first time, and based upon the testimony of Detective Gill, you have not, there's been an interview done. Excuse me for one moment. Detective Gill testified he contacted the State Bureau of Identification on April 24th, correct? I'm sorry, yeah, April 24th, 2013. He contacted the SBI and the Board of Elections, correct?
Yes, sir.
Neither of those agencies had any information regarding any improprieties with the Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
True. Yes, sir.
The Board of Elections identified Attorney John Wallace as the treasurer of the Brad Miller campaign account, correct?
Yes, sir.
Detective Gill testified that on April 25th at 2:45 in the afternoon, which would be 3 hours and 15 minutes prior to the time that you're going to see Mr. Broyhill at Wake Med, he contacted Mr. Wallace, correct?
If that's what his supplement says, yes, sir.
That's what he testified to as well.
Right.
And in that interview, he talked with Mr. Wallace about Mr. Broyhill, Ms. Hahn, all the stuff that he talked about regarding what he knew about this thing, correct?
Yes, sir.
Of course, by that point, he had heard that Ms. Hahn had passed away.
Yes, sir.
She passed away in the early morning hours of the 24th, correct?
Correct.
And at that point, this case changed from one of an assault to a homicide, correct?
Yes, sir.
And of course, he was the treasurer for Brad Miller, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he was, of course, concerned about anything involving Mr. Miller, correct?
Sure.
Because he's the treasurer of that campaign account, right?
Yes, sir.
Of course, you heard all his testimony on that afternoon.
I did.
Mr. Wallace didn't know anything about any money being gone at that particular point in time, correct?
No, sir.
He did say that he had met with them the week prior, the Monday prior, the 15th of April, and that to the best of his knowledge, based upon the FEC report that had been shown to him, there was about $60,000 in the account, correct?
Correct.
And I'm ballparking, because you might have said 62, right?
It was substantial more than what it actually was, yes.
Yeah. Well, we now know there was none, correct?
Correct.
But he said he thought, as of the meeting, he was not aware of that on the 25th when when Detective Gill was talking to Mr. Wallace, correct? Mr. Wallace wasn't aware of that yet,
No, sir.
that the money had been depleted.
Correct.
He thought there was what was in the report, $60,000 in the account, correct?
Yes, sir.
He said he was going to go check the bank the next morning, which would have been the 26th, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he said if there was anything to report, he'd let Detective Gill know,
Yes, sir.
which is what he did.
Yes.
But on the 25th, at that point, the issues were different. The issues were about the impropriety with the FEC report, correct?
Correct.
That was his concern.
Yes.
His concern was that on the Wednesday prior to this crime, when the Hans were at the beach, that he had been contacted by this Tom Keating gentleman who alerted him to these letters that were on the FEC website, correct?
Yes.
Among which included this one letter about donations having been refunded to certain donors in excess of the amount of money that they had actually received, correct?
Yes, sir.
That was a concern that he told Detective Gill he had addressed to Ms. Hahn and Mr. Broyhill, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that he had gotten an email from Mr. Broyhill on the 18th, after copying both of them, saying that he was going to be looked into and someone would get back to him on Friday, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he said nobody did get back to him on Friday, correct?
Correct.
And it was a concern for him because these are things he thought he would have been heard about prior to that time, correct?
That's right.
And he suggested to you, maybe she confronted him about that, correct?
I don't recall if he
Maybe
did.
not to you, but to Detective Gill.
He may have.
So Detective, that would be worth following up on, correct?
Yes, sir.
And the donor list was something that you said you saw when you were at the house on the 22nd.
Yes, sir.
You saw that information on the table.
Yes.
So now you've seen this information. Detective Gill has talked to the treasurer that points out these things. And prior to that, I'm not commenting in a bad way, unless you're like Mr. Hahn. He said he's a political nerd. You weren't following any of this stuff at that time, correct?
No, I was not.
Probably didn't even know how to access, until this case, the FEC website, right?
I did not, no.
But didn't take a lot of figuring out to do it. You're skilled in searching stuff. You went on and first of all, he forwarded to Detective Gill the emails.
He did.
So now you have something that seems suspicious, correct?
Yes.
Refunds being given to people in excess of the amount that they had donated. And letters being sent to the campaign, and the treasurer knows nothing about it. Not a bad idea to go back and talk to Mr. Broyhill about it, correct?
Correct.
Because you did bring up the donor refunds with him because it was on the table when you met with him on the 23rd, right? Not a lot, but you brought it up a little bit.
Yes.
So this, and this is not untypical in a homicide investigation.
True.
You get a little piece of something, then you find out something more and you go follow it up.
That's right.
So you went to go follow it up on the 25th.
We did.
Mr. Arbor, we're going to break for recess. Could counsel approach just for a moment? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take our lunch recess now, and we'll resume at 2:30. If you recall the instructions that I've given to you In this matter, please don't talk about this case among yourselves or with anyone else. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters. Please have no conversations with parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you leave your notepads in your chairs, gather in the deliberation room at 2:30. Thank you very much. Everyone else, please remain seated. Detective, you may step down. Are there matters, counsel, that we need to take up outside the presence of the jury? Mr. Fawcett?
Not from the state, Your Honor.
Mr. Arbor? All right, very well. We'll be in recess until